Hello and welcome to David's Politics Show. At the dawn of the 20th century, Imperial Germany began to dream of its own place in the sun, great power status, its own Weltpolitik. There was only one problem: the Royal Navy. Admiral Tirpitz sought to hold the world's largest naval force at risk by building a gigantic fleet of his own. The so-called Tirpitz Plan did much to sour Anglo-German relations in the years leading up to the First World War. Well, as the saying goes, the more things change, the more they seem to stay the same. China in the 21st century seems to have been dreaming much the same dreams lately. The scale and extent of Chinese naval modernization in the past 3 decades has been staggering. One objective above all has focused the minds of the PLAN's planners: to push the US Navy as far away from China's and Taiwan's coasts as possible. Any plausible plan for the defense of Taiwan will have to reckon with a powerful, sophisticated, and above all large Chinese naval presence. My guest today has spent decades carefully observing and warning about the growing threat posed by the PLAN. Captain James Fanell is a retired naval intelligence officer whose most recent assignment was as the Director of Intelligence and Information Operations for the US Pacific Fleet. He previously also served as the Senior Intelligence Officer for China in the Office of Naval Intelligence. Captain Fanell has been a National Security Affairs Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford and is now based at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. Jim, it's great to have you on the show. Welcome.
Well, David, thank you very much. It's an honor to talk with you.
So I'd like to take this great opportunity that I have you on the podcast to really kind of pick your mind about some of the concrete nitty-gritty details of the platforms and the technologies, because I think it's a fascinating topic, and to some extent one has to go into the detail to be able to understand what's going on. But let me begin this conversation by kind of asking you a big picture question, which is, as I said in the intro, the Chinese have really made incredible progress in the past 2 to 3 decades in terms of their naval power projection capabilities. And to some extent, this marks a shift, right? Because in the 20th century, China was mostly a land power. So could you give us a sense of kind of the scale of this change? I mean, you've been observing it as I said, for decades. And also, could you explain for our listeners how you think the Chinese themselves have started to think about their own navy and the lessons you think they've drawn in terms of the need for and the uses of naval power since the, let's say, 1990s?
Yeah, David, I think you've characterized it correctly, which is to say that historically, China, now the People's Republic of China, has been a land power. And they had a brief interlude with some naval issues and maritime issues back in the 1400s with this eunuch Admiral Zheng He that was allegedly was going out throughout the Indian Ocean and taking kind of China trade and doing some of that. But since then, that kind of all withered away, and for the last 500 years plus, it was a land power. But what occurred I think in the late 90s, after the PRC under Deng Xiaoping, their paramount leader at the time, opened up China's economy, that was in the 1980s. By the late 90s, they realized that in order to be able to have a large economy and a global economy, one that could sustain their population and achieve their strategic goals, they needed to have a navy. And I think what happened in 1995 and 96 with the missile crisis in Taiwan, mm-hmm. when the former leader of Taiwan went back to his, at the time he was the leader, Lee Teng-hui, when he went to his alma mater at Cornell, and the United States administration let him do that, which was nothing unusual in the sense of who can call out somebody's leader going to another country to visit. But this
Right.
upset the Chinese Communist Party because they don't believe that Taiwan's independent from them. And they were very upset that the United States had given Taiwan this kind of independence boost, if you will, this thinking
Mm.
that they're independent and separate. So they started launching missiles at Taiwan in 95 and 96. And in response, the United States sent some carriers there. And basically, it was a worldwide loss of face to the PRC and to the Chinese Communist Party, because there was nothing they could do, because they had no navy, they had no ability to impact the U.S. Seventh Fleet and our carriers and our capabilities out there.
Hmm.
So it's very clear from the the data that we have and the history that we have is that the Chinese leadership said we're going to respond to that. So Jiang Zemin, who was then in that time frame, was the leader of China, set the PLA on this path towards this what Xi now calls the Great Rejuvenation. But they started on this modernization of their military, and it shifted from this army-centric focus to this naval-centric focus.
Hmm.
And when after Jiang Zemin, you had Hu Jintao, and we know that when he was the paramount leader in the early 2000s, he ordered the PLA to have the capability to take Taiwan by 2020. And Xi Jinping reinstituted that when he came to power late 2012, 2013. So we have evidence that Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and Xi Jinping had all been, reordering, if you will, the PLA from being army centric to naval and air centric,
Hmm.
and strategic rocket missiles. And so what happened even in 2015, Xi Jinping instituted some major reforms to the PLA. He reorganized from 7 military regions to 5 theater commands. He created the Strategic Support Force, the Joint Logistics Support Force. And then what he did is something that people may not really remember, but he created a separate People's Liberation Army, a PLA Army, so People's Liberation Army.
Hmm.
So before 2015, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, meant it was also the ground forces, but it also covered all the other services.
Mm. It was kind of like the armed forces in general, right?
Correct. And so what Xi did is he broke out the People's Liberation Army as on equal, quote unquote, equal footing with the People's Liberation Army Navy, the People's Liberation Army Air Force, the People's Liberation Army Strategic Rocket Force, and these other forces. And so what it did is it really, some people could say, well, it elevated the Army. No, what it did is it sublimated the Army. And then what you saw was, and what we've seen for 25 years, is the massive amount of resources that have gone into the Navy. And so from
Hmm.
2000, for instance, the Chinese was what we would have characterized then as a brown water Navy, a Navy of small ships, largely comprised of ships from Mao's era, ships from the 50s and 60s, very small numbers, inadequate capabilities, and not a power projection capability. And today, 2022, coming on 2023, the People's Liberation Army Navy, the PLA Navy, is now the largest navy in the world in total number of ships, but also in the last 10 years, they've outproduced the United States in terms of tonnage,
Hmm.
and they've also outproduced us in what I consider to be the most important weapon system in naval warfare today, which is anti-ship cruise missiles. So the Chinese have supersonic, sea skimming, long range, 250 to 350 kilometer supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles, and the United States is still dealing with largely subsonic 70s, 80s technology harpoon
Hmm.
missiles that are 75 miles, less than 120 kilometers, 140 kilometers. So we're dealing with a mismatch in terms of not just the numbers of platforms, not just the size of the platforms, even though the United States Navy still is, I think, 3 times the size of the Chinese Navy in terms of tonnage because of our large aircraft carriers, but they're catching up. And so
Right.
I use this phrase strategic trend line. And so what I see is a strategic trend line over the last 25 years where the PLA Navy is growing and growing and growing. and they're now at this capability, at least in terms of what's happening in the Western Pacific, that they can dominate the waters of the first and second island chain and essentially implement what they had been working on, this counter intervention strategy, which, as you said in your opening, which was designed to keep the US Navy as far away from China's coast and Taiwan as possible. And they've been working on that. And I believe in their own minds in Beijing and the PLA and the Central Military Commission that they believe that they're at that capability with the weapon systems and everything that they have. And remember, China's got the largest number of platforms, warships, and submarines, and it's larger than the U.S. Navy. But we are a global Navy, so when
Right,
we
right,
talk about the U.S. Navy, it's not like the entirety of the U.S. Navy's in the Western Pacific,
right.
and so our Navy is actually much smaller. If you look at the size of the U.S. Seventh Fleet, we're talking less than 100 warships, well less
Hmm.
of warships and submarines, and China's, 400, about 400. So we're in a severe mismatch. And then when you throw in the ability of their land forces, like their PLA Air Force, to be able to launch bombers and fighters with anti-ship cruise missiles, similar to the ones that are on their warships and in their submarines. And
Hmm.
then they have the strategic rocket force that can launch anti-ship cruise missiles from shore. You really start to realize that their strategy has been, you know, well thought out, and they've developed it, and they're ready to execute if they don't believe that they can get this political reconciliation that they want, which is to say Taiwan will become part of the People's Republic of China, much like Hong Kong now is, uh, today, when it wasn't just a few years ago.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's nominally they nominally paid lip service to the one country two systems, but it's more like one country one system now, in Hong Kong. So that's great because we're right into the meat of the discussion, and I'd like to now ask you a little bit more about some of these more specific details regarding, as you said, the actual missile technology, the platforms, etc. So we know that they put a lot of emphasis and a lot of resources into their anti-ship ballistic missiles, the DF-21, the DF-26, and also, as you mentioned, their cruise missiles. I believe it's the YJ-18. So I'd like to ask you kind of two interconnected questions. One is, how good are these? And you've already alluded to that. How you think they plan on using them? I mean, to some extent, it sounds like it's kind of a saturation strategy that they're going for. But also, how good you think they've become or are becoming at actually shortening and closing their kill chain. In other words, finding the U.S. ships in the Pacific, tracking them, and actually being able to hit moving targets.
Right. So I think that's the key question, and that's debated a lot today, which is to say, well, they may have these missile systems, but the problem that they have is they can't find us.
Hmm.
Um, and I would say that that's something that, in my experience in my life in the Navy, was my job was to do the exact opposite. Was the U.S. was trying to find adversary fleets to make sure we knew where their platforms were at all times. And it's a big ocean, and it's a big world, and it's hard. Um, but what I can say is that China didn't just buy a bunch of bullets and didn't think about how to shoot them.
Yeah.
And so, concurrent with their strategy, this, you mentioned kill chain. So this end-to-end kill chain thinking is something that the Chinese have is part of their master plan. And so they've been putting up satellites in space uh, at a phenomenal rate over the last decade. And in the last 5 to 7 years, they've put up as many satellites as the United States, at least in terms of these things that are dedicated to be used by the PLA for what I call their maritime intelligence architecture,
Hmm.
or their ISR architecture, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance architecture. So, when I retired in 2015, early 2015, the Chinese, I would say, were just beginning to embark upon putting up satellites that were electronic intelligence satellites, signals intelligence satellites, imagery intelligence satellites that were geosynchronous, that were sun synchronous, so that they could have this better understanding of what was going on in the maritime domain. And they've been, in the last 10 years, just really putting up a constellation of platforms and relay satellites that make sure that the data doesn't have to, in the old days, for us back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, a satellite would take a picture and then, would have to, continue around the Earth before the picture could be downloaded again to a ground station somewhere in the United States.
Hmm.
And China was under those same kind of constraints 10 years ago. But today they have relay satellites. So a satellite collects something and immediately can transfer that data to a relay that can get down into an intelligence center and an operations center for the PLA in order to provide real time targeting intelligence for all those weapon systems that we just talked about. So they've been working towards that, and I would say that's just in the space arena. And then we know that China, for instance, has the largest fishing fleets in the world. So
Hmm.
you have literally thousands of PRC fishing fleets that are all equipped with communications capabilities. For instance, if you go back to 2012, even in the Scarborough Shoal incident off of Manila, 140 kilometers off of Manila, you had Scarborough Shoal, 140 miles,
Hmm.
and the these commercial vessels that were inside this Filipino shoal, when the Philippine military went on board to look at them and find out what they were doing, poaching inside their EEZ, they were able to see that they had this Beidou communication system, this GPS system, their equivalent, and that the Beidou systems, the Beidou handset, had a communication system so that the head of the Chinese Coast Guard or the Chinese fishing fleet companies could communicate to these vessels and tell them what to do. Vice versa, these vessels, when they saw something, they could provide back and say, "Hey, I'm located at this geo coordinate, and I just saw a U.S. Navy warship pass by."
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
that's another layer of this, what I call the maritime intelligence architecture of the PRC. They also have ground-based collection capabilities that can collect long-range radar collection. And then they have what we've been reading about, most worrisome to me in the last 5 years, is their focus now on this undersea domain and putting in arrays and buoys and submarines and things of that nature that's going to give them insight into what's going on in the undersea domain, all of which contributes to this, what we in the US call the common operational picture. And so, war is dependent today on having an accurate, timely, and relevant common operational picture. And the Chinese understand that because they've read all of our unclassified, documents, all the briefings and videos we put out on Discovery Channel and all those things. They've sucked all that up and they know how important that is. So then the question is, okay, so you've built this architecture for maritime intelligence, architecture collect data. You've got weapons. Now can you make it work? And so the last part of the equation is, what have we seen them do? And I can't go into details, but I can basically say throughout my career, what I was seeing was, again, a strategic trend line of the PRC being increasingly capable of taking, disparate pieces of information from various sources and aligning fires from warships at sea, submarines at sea, aircraft coming out over the sea, and land based firing systems, all being able to integrate fires with simultaneous times on target from multiple vectors
Hmm.
and and not just at static targets, but at maneuvering targets. And we can go back to, I think it was October of 2020 when we saw, in terms of ballistic missiles, we saw a salvo launch of DF-21Ds and DF-26s that launched from maximum ranges from thousands of, 1,000+ kilometers into a closure area into the South China Sea, southeast of Hainan Island, and they were able to hit. We think, by all accounts, they were successful in hitting a moving target.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
So I guess what I'd say is, no navy on the earth today has fought a naval battle at sea since, I guess you could say, maybe the Korean War with the Incheon invasion, or going back even farther to World War II. So nobody's really fought a naval war. We've been 30 years fighting wars in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan. Uh, we had a Vietnam War, we had a Korean War, but we haven't had a really naval battle. And China's been preparing for that and practicing that because they know that the number one threat to their ability to launch an invasion of Taiwan, should it come to that, is, a naval force. And the United States Seventh Fleet, and augmented by West Coast Pacific Fleet forces, would, theoretically disrupt some kind of Taiwan invasion of Taiwan. And so they've prepared themselves to disrupt our counter, and that's why they call it a counter intervention strategy. We call it anti-access area denial on the U.S. side.
Right, right. Yeah, it's astonishing how effective they've been at not just developing, as you said, just building an immense amount of platforms and developing really quite sophisticated missiles, but also kind of absorbing the Western view of how to conduct precision warfare, right? I mean, this notion of as you said, having an overall picture and thinking of it as a system, right? And they too have been have started talking about kind of disarticulating our systems, right, or a system of systems, and so on and so forth. One other thing that I wanted to ask you about or mention is, do you think they've studied, for example, the Falklands War? Because that was one, I mean, even though it was a relatively limited engagement, the British came quite close to losing precisely because of anti-ship cruise missiles. I mean, they got very lucky in a couple of cases where the bombs didn't actually detonate. They went through the hulls, but they didn't detonate. But they were the surface vessels were very vulnerable to even just not that many Argentinian fighters flying from the mainland. Do you think they've taken a look at that?
Oh, definitely. And I don't have the reports here, but I know that, like, at the Navy War College, the China Maritime Studies Institute has they're voracious readers of Chinese academics and Chinese literature, and the Chinese have studied not only U.S. engagements, going back to World War II, but they've also studied what's happened in the Falklands. So they're very much aware of that, and that's why their ships and have close-in weapon systems similar to what United States has tried to do, to be able to shoot down and defeat incoming missile systems.
Hmm.
And that's why I've been kind of over the years, and my mentors have always, drilled into me that speed is life, speed is the key. And so when we only have subsonic missiles, like the Harpoon, and we go up against a Type 055 Renhai class cruiser that's got 112, VLS tubes, vertical launch system tubes, that can launch land attack cruise missiles, surface to surface missiles, surface to air missiles. They also have close in weapon systems that would, be used to defeat and knock down a barrage of, American made anti-ship or surface-to-surface missiles or anti-ship missiles. And so
Hmm.
you see now in the last couple of years, the U.S. Navy and the Department of Defense has been moving out in that direction. That's why you see a naval version of the TLAM in terms of, Tomahawk land attack missile, TLAM. So now there's a TLAM that's designed to go after ships. So it's the same frame, it's the same weapon system, and it can travel a long range, 1,500 miles maybe. The problem is it's very slow. And so if you're on a Renhai class cruiser and you've got a very effective close-in weapon system, you're going to be able to knock that down as it gets close in, and the
Hmm.
effects of it will be mitigated. And so I think that's what the Chinese are doing. The latest, well, anyway, I would just say that they're aware of that, of what it takes to be able to defend their platforms. But I think they've also built so many platforms that one of the things that we tend not to, in our mindsets and I don't know when we went from this kind of concept in World War II where we built so much to have overmatch to now where we build, three Zumwalt class cruisers and we run out of money. And
Hmm.
you're like, how can three cruisers have any impact on a naval battle between two large navies? Uh, we, we, we've, uh, we've forgotten that what's necessary sometimes is mass, and the old saying, quantity has a quality all of its own. And I think the Chinese have designed their systems to be survivable for sure. They're going to use that same technology to defend their platforms, but they're also building so many platforms that they're anticipating that they'll lose some, but that losing them will not stop their ultimate achieving their end state.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, they've built in certain calculations in terms of attrition much more. Let me ask you about another platform where traditionally the U.S. Navy obviously had a massive advantage, namely aircraft carriers. Now the Chinese have built a couple of them too. I think two, and they're building a third, if I'm not mistaken. What can you tell us about the kind of the level of proficiency they've reached in terms of being able to generate sorties, ability to stay deployed at sea, refuel at sea for long periods of time? How well protected are the carriers by submarines and by the surface fleet? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's a long. There's a lot to that question, but I'll just try to get right at it. So first of all, they've got three aircraft carriers. The third one, CV-18, the Fujian, was just launched here this year, and it's got electromagnetic aircraft launch system, or EMALS,
Hmm.
which is something that the United States is still just unveiling with our USS Ford aircraft carrier, and the first ship ever in the world to have, instead of steam catapults, to have the EMAL system. And so it was very shocking to see that in China's just third aircraft carrier, and only the second that they produced totally in China, had this EMAL system. Now, it doesn't have nuclear power plant, but I'm sure the fourth carrier or the fifth will have nukes. They're going to go there.
Hmm.
Uh, so they have stolen huge, huge amounts of technology. You may have heard that there's a trial of an Australian, a former U.S. Marine aviator,
Yes. Yeah.
who was
Hmm.
brought up for selling the tactics, techniques, and procedures to land on board an aircraft carrier. So they've been able to acquire all this information, and in a relatively short time that took America 100 years, they've been able to, in less than 20 years, acquire the technology, acquire and build the platforms, and they're flying, on and off their or their jets on and off their aircraft carriers. As we're sitting here talking, out in the Western Pacific in the Philippine Sea, their first carrier that came from the Ukraine, but was refurbished by them and basically commissioned back in 2012, the Liaoning CV-16. It's at sea right now, and the Japanese are giving us some, for the first time ever, some kind of substantive details about their flight operations. And so we're hearing numbers of 70 to 80 sorties in a couple of days. So it's nowhere near the kind of sortie generation that U.S. Navy's had. I spent the first 20 years of my career when I was at sea on aircraft carriers, and we could put up huge amounts of sorties in a 24-hour period, well over 100, sometimes close to 200. And so the Chinese are not quite there yet, but again, they have, the first two carriers are ski jump, so they don't have a catapult system, so they're restricted on ordnance or restricted on fuel, and that puts a crimp in their ability to generate sorties. They're also, the first two are 45,000, 50,000 tons, where a Nimitz class carrier is 85,000 tons.
Hmm.
The Ford is over 100,000 tons. So there's a lot of a limitation in the number of platforms, number of jets and helicopters that they can keep on their carriers. But for what they have, it's clear that what they did last year, starting last December, when we first started getting an inkling of their kind of real carrier qualification and carrier operational training, that they're making significant advancements. And I guess what I'd say is some people would say, well, that's no threat to the United States and our aircraft carriers and the rest of the world. Maybe. But when you combine these new aircraft carriers from China along with all these missile systems that we talked about, and then they're escorting submarines and all these other things, you provide just another layer of complication for Taiwan's defenses and for the United States' ability to operate. So now we saw in August there was this big exercise that the Chinese did, and they operated again like they are today east of Taiwan. If you go back 10 years ago, Taiwan military planners weren't really planning on having to deal with the Chinese attacking them from the east. Now they have to. So this is just another, it's just another, they say the death by a thousand cuts. This is just another cut that defense planners in Taiwan and American Indo Pacific planners have to deal with. And I think in terms of their carrier strike group concept, it's almost it's spooky. It's almost exactly like an American carrier strike group concept. You have an aircraft carrier that launches the jets. You have airborne early warning and airborne control that they're developing to put on board their carriers. You
Hmm.
have helicopters that can rescue down pilots and do replenishment, with the ships in the carrier strike group. Then you have escort. So you'll have the Liu Yang 3, the type 052 Delta Liu Yang 3 destroyers that have long range cruise missiles, but also have longer range surface to air missiles that can provide air to air warfare protection in a bubble around the carrier so that opposing carriers planes can't get in. So that's part of the carrier strike group of the PLA Navy. And then you add in one of these Type 055 Renhai class cruisers that has this, as I mentioned, 112 VLS tubes. And now all of a sudden you get the same thing that we have in the U.S. Navy. When I was in the Kitty Hawk Carrier Strike Group in Japan, we always had a cruiser with us that we would call Shotgun Whiskey, Alpha Whiskey, the name for it. And Composite Warfare Commander Scheme was the designation was Alpha Whiskey Air Warfare. But their job was to provide this kind of they had an Aegis radar that could provide the total situational awareness in the air picture around the carrier, and then they could shoot planes down with other ships in the strike group. And the Chinese have built that system with their Dragon Eye radars on board, their phased array radars on board the Renhai class cruisers, and also on the Liu Yang 3s. So you have this great air warfare picture, so you know what aircraft are in your zone, and then you have shooters that can shoot down incoming plane or incoming missiles.
Hmm.
And then they're being escorted. We saw in the press already this week, Chinese press is saying, yeah, we've got this many ships out there. They don't call it a carrier strike group, but that's what it is. And then they say, and we also have some unknown number of nuclear submarines. So they're doing exactly what the United States has talked about doing over the last, 50 years, which is you have this composite carrier strike group with surface ships that protect it that can also shoot out and shoot other ships. And then you have submarines as kind of this other undersea domain protection.
Hmm.
And and then you asked about replenishment at sea. And the Chinese, they have an admiral, Admiral Wu Shengli, who was the chief of their navy over a decade ago. And Admiral Wu recognized early on that one of the limitations of having a blue water navy, an open ocean navy, was you had to have replenishment at sea. Because unless you're nuclear powered, all the other ships that aren't nuclear powered require fuel. And if you're steaming around at high speeds and doing operations, you're going to need fuel every 3 or 4 or 5 days. And so you have to have a fleet of oilers. And so they had some Type 903 uh, replenishment ships that were smaller. And then they now have started building the Type 901. Yeah, the 901 is the comprehensive resupply ships. Those are the newest ones. And these are huge ships that are the same size as the U.S. Navy's Henry J. Kaiser class replenishment ship. So they're quite large and they can replenish two Renhai class cruisers concurrently. And so the Chinese are building a fleet of these. They already got quite a number of the 903s, and they're building a fleet of these 901s, which is exactly what the U.S. Navy did, which will allow them not only to be effective in the operations around Taiwan, where replenishment at sea isn't as critical, because if you're operating north south or in the Taiwan Strait or even east of Taiwan, it's not so hard to go back into a Chinese port and
Right.
then reform and get back into that fight. But if you're going to extend power, Chinese naval power into the Indian Ocean, into the Mediterranean, off the west coast of the United States, and even into the Atlantic, you're going to have this fleet of replenishment ships, and they've been building those for over a decade. So, and they're competent now at doing underway replenishment at sea.
Hmm. Yeah, that's it's incredible how they've been able to really develop a whole bubble, right? A protective bubble around the carriers, and they've really thought they've clearly thought this through, right? They have the protective shield around the carrier, the replenishment ships, as you said. One aspect that I'd like to briefly touch on is to ask you about the subsurface warfare aspect. One thing I've heard is that the subsurface element is perhaps the last element where of naval warfare where the U.S. still does have a significant technological advantage. As you said, the electromagnetic catapult system that was stolen somehow, but in terms of silencing technology for the submarines, we may still have an edge there. And obviously, I'm not going to ask you to divulge any classified information, but is there a sense in which we still have a little bit more time there?
Yeah, I mean, we. I'm gonna get. I'm looking for a quote as I'm talking to you that just came out from our commander of U.S. Strategic Command, Admiral Richards,
Hmm.
and he was talking about how America has lost our ability to deter China, and that our deterrence, if you were to call U.S. deterrence by a metaphor, you'd call it a ship. And he said our ship of deterrence is sinking because we're just falling behind. It takes us too long to build things,
Hmm.
and we can't do that. But he did say that in the undersea arena that we're still basically we've got an advantage today in terms of our capabilities at sea in the undersea domain. So I think that's in some sense that's good, but his warning is we can't rest on that, and so
Right.
we've got to do something. As he said, we've got to be able to pick up the pace in terms of, this is his quote, but unless we pick up the pace in terms of getting our maintenance problems fixed and getting new construction going, if we can't figure that out, we're not going to put ourselves in a good position to maintain strategic deterrence and national defense. And he was talking about that in the undersea arena, which he said was the only true asymmetric advantage that the U.S. had today against our opponents like China. So again, like we saw in the carriers, with they've basically went from ski jump, where you fly a plane right off the nose of a ramp, elevated ski jump. They went from that technology, and they're going straight into electromagnetic catapults,
Yeah.
and they're skipping steam. So, skip echelon. They're skipping a whole generation of technology. And I'm afraid in the undersea domain, there's lots going on there that, we can't talk about, but they're aware, they're knowledgeable, they have a huge intelligence service that's seeking out that information. And what we've seen in the last couple of years is them build a new nuclear submarine production facility in Huludao up in the Bohai, and they're now able to really ramp up their own fast attack and ballistic missile submarine production. And those submarines are going to be quieter. The Type 095 and the Type 096, those are going to be quieter than the much noisier Han class fast attack submarines and the Jin class ballistic submarines, which are using today and that are patrolling today, and probably patrolling with the JL-3, submarine launched ballistic missile, which is can range the continental United States. So there's a lot going on there, and as Admiral Richard said, in order for us to stay ahead, we're going to have some really significant reevaluation of how we do things inside the Department of Defense on the U.S. side. And I would say the same thing needs to happen in the NATO arena, as NATO's not just sitting there waiting for the United States to do everything. I mean, I think there's some people that believe that way,
Right.
But can't. This has got to change.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, I want to, as we come towards the close of this great overview, I want to ask you now a slightly different question, which is in terms of how much warning time, or what would be the warning signs of the Chinese going for, a no kidding attack or some kind of attack on Taiwan, whatever modality that takes. It could end up, it could be an actual amphibious assault. It could be a blockade. There are a number of things they could do. Now, if we kind of, as an analogy, think about the Russia-Ukraine situation, obviously there are many differences, but it's clear that the U.S. intelligence agencies were all over the preparations the Russians were making. I mean, from the initial buildup in the spring of, I think it was the spring of 2021, when they were doing their so-called exercises, and they left a bunch of stock there, left a bunch of equipment. And in October, November of last year, it's clear now that the U.S. government, the U.S. intelligence agencies had a pretty good understanding of what the Russians were doing. And I think when you read a lot of the commentary in the media, you can sometimes get the impression that wars begin overnight. That there's just like, it's kind of, from one day to the next, if the political leadership decides to get the party started, it just happens. But of course, it's not like that. You need to, pre-position all kinds of equipment. You need to make all sorts of plans. And a lot of these things can be seen, can be detected in a number of ways. So could you kind of help us understand, from, you've had years and years of experience looking at these things in detail, what are the kinds of things you think we would be looking for? What are the kinds of things we would see? What are kind of some of the telltale signs that would point towards the Chinese political leadership having made a no kidding decision to make a significant move on Taiwan?
Right. Well, let me step back and say, as somebody who was a professional naval intelligence officer for 29 years, you have to ask yourselves, in the case of Russia, I saw that this administration and the current director of national intelligence and the national security advisor have been very vocal about praising themselves for their intelligence success and predicting that by 2 weeks or something that the Chinese or that the Russians are going to invade Ukraine.
Hmm.
And I take a different view. I take the strategic view, which is to say, hmm, when did Russia take Crimea? Oh yeah, that was in 2014. So what happened between 2014 and January, Feb, or whenever that occurred there in February of 2022? In those 8 years, what did anybody do from either administration to deter Russia from doing what they've done here?
Hmm.
And so my sense of it is that much in that analogy that I just gave to you, and you people can make their own determination, but in terms of the China problem, we have done the same thing. I have been warning for over a decade that the Chinese were coming to take Taiwan, and I have predicted. I have an assessment that's called the Decade of Concern, which says that the Chinese, as I mentioned, were ordered to be able to have the capability militarily to take Taiwan as early as 2020, and that because of their grand rejuvenation ceremony that would occur in 1 October 2049, that most likely the latest that they could use military force to take Taiwan and still expect the world to forget about that military event, which could take several years, and then come to Beijing for a ceremony, is about 20 years. Kind of the same difference between what happened at Tiananmen Square in 1989 and everybody rushing to Beijing to watch the opening ceremony of the 2008 Olympics. In 1989, condemned China as barbaric
Hmm.
for killing its citizens and its students with tanks. But 19 years later, the president of the free world, George W. Bush, was sitting in the Bird's Nest Stadium out in the bleachers in the seats with the regular people,
Hmm.
with his coat off and with his tie off and with sweat stains under his armpits, sitting in 95-degree heat and 100% humidity. Uh, and you have to ask yourself, if you're in China and you're a military planner or a Communist Party member, you're going to say, we already think the West is decadent. We already think the West has a short attention span. And then we have an example where it was in just 19 years, they went from calling us barbarians for what we did at Tiananmen to coming to our Olympic ceremony.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
in the same sense, if you back up from 1 October 2049, which is the 100th anniversary of the PRC, that becomes 2030. So I've been warning that between 2020 and 2030 is what I call the decade of concern. And then last year, Admiral Davidson talked about 2027. You had the Taiwan defense minister talk about 2025 last year. You've had a number of statements, so you're hearing all these comments about this decade now. And so there's been strategic warning, but that strategic warning has not moved the needle, has not caused the United States Congress or any administration to dramatically build up its deterrence capability against the PRC. If you go back to World War II, when after December 7th, 1941, this devastating loss, the United States lost all its battleships and was now all of a sudden having to rely on these aircraft carriers for the first time ever. And we only had about 5 of them. And many of them were being damaged in Battle of Coral Sea and Battle of Midway. And so at any one time, Admiral Nimitz was never really had more than 4 aircraft carriers from 1942 to 1943 for over a year and a half. And it wasn't until the mid to late 1943 that something happened. And that was that all ships that had been designed and built or planned or paid for to be built with the 1940 Two Ocean Navy Act. So Congress passed in 1940 the Two Ocean Navy Act, led by this guy named Carl Vinson, a Southern Democrat. And history will say he was a racist and a bad guy, but he led the way in a bipartisan way to pass a bill that told the United States, we don't know what's happening out there in the Pacific, but it's not good. So we need to start building Navy ships.
Yeah.
And they started that. Well, nothing's happened like that today in the United States. You don't have anybody saying, we're always reading about over the last 5 years, the US Navy doing another fleet assessment of how many ships it should have. And we're fighting over, is it, today we're at 290 ships, and it was going to go down under Biden this last budget. If the Congress had not plussed up another chunk of money, it was going to go down to 280 ships. It may now go to 290 or 295 or something. And they're debating whether it'll be 315, 325. I mean, there's no real serious effort to have this comprehension of strategic warning. And so that's at the strategic level. And that concerns me, that we have a system whereby the people in the defense industry, not just Boeing and Raytheon and all that. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the Congress and the Pentagon and the State Department, the people that are there representing American citizens to say, you're there to protect us. And so you need to be able to look out over the horizon and see what's coming, the threats that are coming, and prepare our nation. And that hasn't happened.
Mm-hmm.
So now when you get down to the operational warning and tactical warning, now we're in a much different situation. As you noted for Russia, we had a lot of tactical warning. We have the satellites, we have ships, we have the ability to know when small things are moving around in a battlefield like uh, the Russia-Ukraine border. But what happens if you're going up against a country like China that understands that America fights and wins with its eyes and ears, what it can see with its satellites, what it can hear with its satellites? They know that. And we know that the Chinese, in addition to putting up their own intelligence collection satellites, they've put up anti-satellite satellites.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if in the case of a confrontation with Taiwan, over Taiwan, who knows if we're going to be able to see all that? If you talk to experts in Taiwan and people that I've talked to, you've heard estimates from 7 days, 14 days, 30 days of warning. But is that really enough warning when you're facing an adversary that's got overmatch?
Mm-hmm.
So what if we get 30 days of warning that China is going to invade Taiwan when we don't have the ships, we don't have the anti-ship cruise missiles, we don't have the ability to impact that invasion force? We can know it, we can say we can see it, we may send a couple of extra aircraft carriers, but those aircraft carriers may be sitting targets to a DF-26 or a DF-21D. And
Mm.
so I think that's really the issue that I have. I mean, we want tactical warning. We want to make that number as big as possible. We 90 days would be great. But my message is we have had 10 years of warning of what China intends to do.
Hmm.
And most of the experts, the China hands in Washington, the people that are, the experts, so-called experts, they always talk about China takes the long view. And they're always demurring and deferring and saying China would never use force. Well, okay, but what if you're wrong? And if you're wrong, done to deter them, or what have we done to be able to defeat them when they do that? And in the case of Hong Kong, there was nothing we could do. If you recall, in the last when this whole Hong Kong issue came about with the umbrella movement and everything, there were a lot of people saying we need to speak up and do something. And a few politicians made some strong speeches. But at the end of the day, China, there was nothing the West could do to stop China from essentially taking total control of 7 million people in Taiwan, or in Hong Kong, not Taiwan, in Hong Kong. It'll be harder for Taiwan because you got 100 miles of a Taiwan Strait separating them. But as we've discussed today, uh, they've built in a plan to try to mitigate all those capabilities for us to stop their invasion fleet. And so I think that's really the concern that I have is that we're kind of there's almost an arrogance there of, oh, we'll see all this and we'll be able to stop it.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and yeah, that's a great point that maybe maybe we as the West in general have to some extent fetishized our intelligence capabilities. And the interesting thing, again, to go back briefly to the Russia-Ukraine situation, is that despite the advance warning, the fact is that many of the political leaders in Europe, and to some extent maybe even in Ukraine itself, didn't believe it. Right? They thought it was a bluff. So the Russians to some extent, and as you said, at the end of the day, when it comes to a no kidding kinetic conflict, then as you say, mass ultimately matters. So the extent to which we saw it coming is ultimately only relatively important, right?
Right. I'd give Averill Haines and Jake Sullivan kudos if they had provided warning and the Russians didn't invade because we made a big we demonstrated we were not going to put up with that, but we didn't. And that was because they didn't really believe the intel. So one of the things as you get older is you find out there are people that are in their own communities, wherever they come from, journalism, law, government, the military, intelligence community. And one of the things I always look for is people that are willing to criticize their own tribe. And so, and that doesn't mean you just wholesale say everything that your tribe does is wrong, or otherwise, why would you worked and lived in it? But I
Mm.
worked and lived in the intelligence community, and I understand it and I know it. And I would say is we can't just walk around and clap ourselves on the back. I used to work for an admiral in out in the Pacific, Admiral Willard, and he used to talk about we got to get rid of happy talk. We can't
Mm.
have this happy talk. We can't convince ourselves that we're greater than we are, and we need to be clear-eyed, especially when it comes to the life and death issues like Taiwan will be. And it won't just be for the 24 million people in Taiwan. It'll be for thousands of Americans. It'll be for millions of Japanese. I suspect it'll be for people in Guam. It'll be people in the Philippines,
In Australia.
Australia for sure. So, and we only are talking about Taiwan, but we have to remember that China has said that by 1 October 2049, they have to have the whole, their whole country restored to what they believe is their territory. So
Right.
that includes the South China Sea, that includes the Senkaku Islands, and it also includes a whole bunch of areas along the Sino Indian border.
Yeah, where they've been causing trouble too.
Yeah, and people have already died there, and so I think we need to be clear-eyed about this. They have a grand strategy, and just trying to wish it away to say they're bluffing or they'd never. And I think then we have to ask ourselves, once they acquire all these quote unquote disputed territories, what's then next? because they have a Belt and Road Initiative. They have designs on, as Gordon Chang likes to talk about, they believe in Tin Jia, this all under heaven, this kind of restoration of their rightful place in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that means they're going to have global, global operations, global access. We see them moving into the, African continent. We've already seen a base in Djibouti. We see what they're doing in the Oceanias, the Solomons, Kiribati. There's all kinds of indicators of where their global vision is. And so we need to be clear-eyed about it. And that's why Taiwan's so important.
Absolutely. And also, if I could just add, a broader point is that Taiwan is also a symbol, right? It's a symbol of whether ultimately the West is willing to fight for what it believes in. And if you don't take a stand when it comes to Ukraine or when it comes to Taiwan, where are you going to take a stand, right? Because as I said, the appetite comes with the eating, right? So if the principle that you're not allowed to change territorial boundaries by force, if that is not sacrosanct in the case of Taiwan, where will it be, right?
Yep, 100% agree.
Jim, this has been a really wonderful, interesting conversation. I think we managed to range over a number of aspects of this difficult and fascinating topic. So I just want to remind my listeners of your work. You're now at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. Are there any other platforms we can mention where people can follow your work?
No, I don't really do social media, given my background.
Right.
So I just I send out emails, and I have a list called the Red Star Risen that I've been doing for about 17 years.
Okay.
I have some people that I send emails to about what China's doing from their own press, and I try to stay engaged that way.
Perfect. All right. Well, Jim, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, David. All the best.
Thanks for tuning in to David's Politics Show. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, do consider subscribing and leaving a rating on whichever platform you use to listen to your favorite podcasts. Thanks very much indeed. And until next time, so long.